All right, then, let's talk about the environmental movement. By the early 1960s, pollution had gotten pretty bad in the United States to the extent that smog, which is a smoky fog, which hadn't even existed, or at least not to the extent that it could be named until I think the late 1930s. The smog was so bad you could barely see Los Angeles and other cities as well, but Los Angeles was especially bad because it is a very automobile-centered city. Also, some places like the Cuyahoga River in Ohio occasionally would burst into flame, and some people thought maybe that's not good. And a lot of the responsibility for at least some of this came from this one individual, Thomas Midgley, who worked for General Motors in the 19-teens, 1920s, and 30s. Thomas Midgley was working on an anti-knock compound in the early 20s, something that you could put in your gas that would keep your engine from knocking. And he found something that would serve that purpose. It was called tetraethyl lead, or as he called it, ethyl, which became the brand name. He called it ethyl because it's shorter than tetraethyl lead and sounds a whole lot better than lead, which is essentially what it was. And some people, even in the early 1920s, found themselves asking the question, gee, is it really a good idea to spew large amounts of lead into the air? To which Thomas Midgley replied, of course, there's no problem with lead. And just to demonstrate that, he went on a speaking tour to discuss the safety of tetraethyl lead. And on this tour, part of the speech was he basically had a bucket full of leaded gasoline that he would stick his head down into and huff right there in front of everybody just to prove that it was safe. He had to cut his tour short when he got lead poisoning. He had to go home and recover from that for a while. Meanwhile, ethyl was in production, and the plant where it was made, within a short period of time, several people died, and several other people went insane. But couldn't possibly be from the lead. Then he moved on from leaded gasoline to try to solve another problem. He was transferred from the automotive part of General Motors to the division called Frigidaire, where he was working on something that could work for refrigerating stuff. And he came up with a solution, something called Freon, which is a chlorofluorocarbon, or CFC. And so that started being used in refrigerators and also as an accelerant in spray bottles, aerosol bottles. Everyone was spraying that stuff in their paint cans and their hairspray cans and everything else by the 1940s and 50s. Well, turns out that large amounts of lead in the air cause heavy pollution. Turns out that it also causes aggression, and it's been, there was a study that demonstrated that it raises the crime rate in cities that have large amounts of leady smog. Chlorofluorocarbons, it was discovered, actually eat up the ozone layer, which protects the planet from solar radiation. So Midgley essentially could be described as the single most destructive organism in the history of the planet Earth. And that's not really an exaggeration so far as one individual organism. Midgley himself suffered all kinds of health problems as side effects largely of lead poisoning, until finally in the 1940s he was unable to walk. And he lived in this house, and he rigged up this elaborate system of ropes and pulleys by which he could propel himself through the house without walking, kind of like Quasimodo. And that worked out fine until he got tangled up in the wires and strangled himself to death. So that was an inauspicious end for the most destructive organism in history. Anyway, by the early 60s, people were definitely noticing, hey, it may not be a good idea if you leave town and before you're even completely out of town, you can't see the town anymore. Another issue that people started noticing, or at least was brought to their attention, was the issue of the heavy use of chemical pesticides, which started after World War II. These pesticides would be dropped from airplanes onto crops, and sometimes in cities, they would actually have a van that would drive through a neighborhood spraying this gas that was pesticide. And I've heard people who were kids in the 50s tell stories about how when the pesticide truck would come, they would all run out so they could play hide and seek in the huge cloud of gas it was spraying. Gee, what could go wrong there? Well, Rachel Carson, a biologist, figured out what was going wrong. She wrote a book called Silent Spring that came out in 1962. And basically the sort of the framing of the book is that she noticed all the places that she used to love to go in the spring where you could hear all the birds singing and chirping. There were no birds singing or chirping there anymore, and she started wondering why. Turns out it's because the birds were eating the insects who had been dosed with DDT. This turns out to be very dangerous pesticide. And then, of course, the birds were eaten by other animals. Sometimes those birds or the other animals worked their way up the food chain and were consumed by people. So this was a huge revelation to the American public. Hey, this stuff is dangerous. And many people point to the publication of this book and the response that it spurred as the beginning of the environmental movement in the United States. And that's something that picked up steam steadily through the 1960s and into the 1970s. So to go back, because I forgot to mention this, to the previous photograph, by the 1970s, it was no longer just accepted that you were going to have, everyone was going to have lead in their gasoline. They started offering you a choice. Regular gas, which was leaded, or you could pay a little bit extra to get it without the lead. Now that sounds kind of strange because today regular just pertains to the octane of the gasoline. But for a long time, even after they knew that lead was dangerous, they still were selling it. By the late 80s into the 90s, unleaded sort of became the norm and started being referred to as regular. Well, now let's take a look at the civil rights movement in this new decade of the 1960s. There were some new approaches being taken, one of which was called the sit-in, which had actually been used in 1958 in Wichita and Oklahoma City, but it was the ones in 1960 that got a large amount of national attention. The first one in Greensboro, North Carolina, at the Woolworths there. The second one in Nashville. And one of the students who helped coordinate the Nashville sit-in was a guy named Marion Barry. Well, what is a sit-in? This is essentially where African Americans, and these were usually college students or college-age individuals, sometimes men and women. In these pictures, I think you're mostly seeing guys, but women were involved as well. What they would do is they would go to one of these, drugstores. Now, this may sound weird to some of my students, but one of the things you used to be able to do at the drugstore was eat lunch. Just in the little town of Sparta, Tennessee, where where I'm from, I remember there being at least maybe 5 or 6 small drugstores in the 1970s that had lunch counters where you could sit and eat. Well, you couldn't do that in 1960 because of segregation laws if you were black. You weren't allowed to sit at the counter. If you wanted food, you could order food, but you'd have to stand there and they'd give it to you, and then you'd have to pay for it and leave and eat it somewhere else. Eat it outside. You weren't allowed the privilege of sitting at the counter because that was for white people. So what these young students would do is they would just come sit down at the lunch counter and order lunch, which was a lot more dramatic than it sounds, right? Because this was violating the policy of the stores and also the local laws. And so they would be told to leave, and they would very politely decline to leave, and they would sit there politely. And then what would usually happen is the police would be called, and the police would come in and arrest them, often beating the crap out of them. And sometimes the angry crowds of white customers would start beating on them before the police got there. Other times the police would, take their time or look the other way while that was happening. And this got a lot of attention, like I said, in the newspapers around the country. And this was something that was very well coordinated, highly orchestrated, and there were even rules that were distributed to these students when they trained for these actions on how they were to behave during a sit-in. So let's take a look at some of those rules. Do not strike back or curse if abused. Do not laugh out. Do not hold conversations with the floor walker. That's the employee who was there. Do not leave your seat until your leader has given you permission to do so. Do not block entrances to stores outside nor the aisles inside, because you could be arrested then for blocking entrance and so forth to the business. Do show yourself courteous and friendly at all times. Do sit straight. Always face the counter. Do report all serious incidents to your leader. Do refer information seekers to your leader in a polite manner. Remember the teachings of Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. Love and nonviolence is the way. Bear in mind, love and nonviolence is not what these protesters were receiving by any means. They were being treated terribly. Well, they were being physically attacked. They were being insulted and cursed and sworn at and spit on. And it would require an enormous amount of self-control to endure all that and still be calm, and not only calm, but still be polite. You can actually get an idea of what the training for this sort of activity was like by reading the 3-part graphic novel March, which is essentially the autobiography of civil rights leader John Lewis, who as a young man was present at these sit-ins in Nashville in 1960. Well, congratulations, because now you have another acronym to add to your list for the civil rights movement. SNCC, usually referred to as SNICC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that was formed in April of 1960 at a conference in Raleigh, North Carolina, that involved students from several different universities and some non-students as well, who had been participating in these sit-ins. Well, you can, as I said, you can add that to your list there with the NAACP, CORE, and the SCLC, except it's easier to say, SNCC. This conference was, like I said, it had a lot of different people It was sort of overseen by Ella Baker of the SCLC and also the NAACP, and now SNCC. So 3 out of the 4 groups. She may have been in core too. I'm not sure. Anyway, she came to help these younger folks, because she was like in her mid 40s probably, help these younger folks get this thing off the ground. And there were several people involved in this who were going to be luminaries in the movement over the coming decade. First one we've already mentioned, Marion Barry, who was a student in Nashville. He would later become the mayor of Washington, D.C. And you probably never heard of him if you're one of my 20-something students, because memory has sort of faded, but he gained quite a bit of notoriety I think it was in the 1990s, when as mayor of Washington, he was arrested buying cocaine from a prostitute at a motel. But yeah, so that's not what he probably would like to be remembered for. Rather, this very courageous period of being a civil rights leader. John Lewis, also previously mentioned as being the subject of the graphic novel March. John Lewis is still, as of 2020, serving as a congressman in the House of Representatives from the state of Georgia, although he has very declining health right now. Stokely Carmichael, who would eventually be the leader of SNCC, he wasn't initially so, he would get much more radical as the decade progressed. And he's one of the, he's one of the luminaries of the Black Power movement that grew from the Civil Rights Movement. Then in the lower right-hand corner, you have Julian Bond, who worked closely with Martin Luther King in the early 60s, and who would later serve for many years, decades, I think, as chairman of the NAACP. So here are some pictures of Julian Bond in the early 1960s. And here's a picture that I include just because I'm a name dropper. Not really. It's just because this was such a big day for me. This is me having a cigarette break with Julian Bond when I dropped him off at the airport in 2005. And I got to meet him and spend the day with him when he visited the University of Illinois to get an honorary degree. And I'd actually quit smoking, but Julian Bond asks you to have a cigarette break, you take one. So anyway, Julian Bond sadly passed away a few years after this photograph was taken.